Mesdames, Messieurs, soyez les bienvenus.
Ladies and gentlemen, be very welcome here. As Sabine said, my name is Charles Rifkin, and I'm honored to be the CEO of the Motion Picture Association. And I wish to thank the teams of the Cannes Film Festival and of the Marché du Film, the film market, because they supported us in the organization of this beautiful event. It's a pleasure to see the Cannes Film Festival in full swing.
In full swing, which also means that the industry is back in full swing, and a great deal of that global connectedness is strengthened by the Transatlantic partnership, which is now more than a century old. In addition to the 100 years of transatlantic storytelling that we're going to celebrate today, we're proud to commemorate the Cannes Film Festival's 75th anniversary, and where better to celebrate the Motion Picture Association's 100th anniversary than right here at the Cannes Film Festival. It's good to return to Cannes, where once again emerging storytellers from around the world can dream about their movies being seen by a wider and responsive audience and launching their careers, and where the bigger names, many of them who saw their careers actually launch here, can reestablish their bona fides, if you will. I'm also delighted to see a wide representation here of our member studios and other American studios and production. As most of you know, two of our most favorite Toms, who are quite famous, are in Cannes this year for major world premieres. Tom Cruise, of course, led the festivities for Paramount Pictures' Top Gun Maverick the other night. I'm not sure how many of you had the chance to see the film, but if you did, you would have noticed that there were multiple times, by my count 4 or 5, when the audience broke into spontaneous applause for this film. And if you look to your left or your right, you would have seen people crying during the film as well. It was an enormous and amazing American spectacle, and one that fits the tradition of the Cannes Film Festival. And then next week, Tom Hanks, another massive American star, will be here for his new film, Warner Brothers' Elvis, which is equally fantastic. I wish I could stay for it, but I've seen it, and I promise you, worth seeing. Universal Pictures is here, another MPA member, and they're here with their Focus Features division's Armageddon Time, directed by James Gray, and I'm sure some of you saw this on Thursday night. Amazing film also in competition. And there'll be special screenings from MGM's 3,000 Years of Longing with Mad Max director George Miller, which stars Idris Elba and Tilda Swinton, and Ethan Coen's documentary on Jerry Lee Lewis called Trouble in Mind. Now, while we rightly recognize the history that has bound us together for more than a century here in Cannes, I want to emphasize the other elements of our theme today. A new era of growth and a new era of innovation. And I believe that these elements are mutually complementary because the strength of our partnership is critical to the success of our future. And a large part of that is the ability to embrace change together. And thanks in part to the presence of Andrea Callas, who's sitting in the front row here, Senior Vice President of Archives, and she'll be on the Roundtable today. But her presence reminds me of a particularly apropos story about Marcel Pagnol. And now, Pagnol, as many of you know, was the great French playwright and filmmaker whose debut film in 1931 was an adaptation of his own play, Marius, and it was produced by Paramount Pictures in 1931. In a 1973 documentary, he recounted how he received extremely hostile criticism for having made this movie, for daring to reframe a fantastic play into what many considered a vulgar art form film. And according to Pagnol, he never forgot what one magazine writer wrote about him after all those years. He could still quote it verbatim. The magazine writer said, "With his shabby flesh and his long face," the article said, "this sly trickster never interested anyone except advertising salesmen. He looks like an anemic anteater who's been stripped to the bone by his red ants." Well, some pretty strong language. But fortunately, the ones who perceived Pagnol to be destroying the very foundations of respectable art soon found themselves on the wrong side of history. And Pagnol would later be lionized by the next generation of filmmakers, the Truffauts, the Romers, the Godards, for taking the first bold step and embracing the future. And Paramount Pictures was there with him for his very first film. From the very beginning of our industry, we've worked closely together, America and Europe, not only in terms of shared productions and resources, but shared values as well. On both sides of the Atlantic, we've always been committed to freedom of speech and freedom of expression as the necessary foundation for our industry to survive and thrive. As I'm sure the French historian Olivier Loubs, who sits on today's panel, will tell you, the Cannes Film Festival was conceived on the eve of World War II by the French government with considerable support from the American film industry as well as the British government and others to raise the flag of freedom of speech and freedom of expression, free at the time of fascist intervention. But sadly, as you're going to hear, the war came before art. And at the end of the war, the 81-year-old Louis Lumière, who of course, les Frères Lumière, everyone knows, created film, Louis Lumière wrote to my predecessor, Will Hayes, on the eve of Hayes' retirement from the Motion Picture Association. And he wrote, "Allow me to hope to have the pleasure of seeing you again in France soon," he said. "The terrible years through which we've just passed have affirmed the great friendship uniting our two countries." So after the war, as Europe was raising itself literally from the ashes of rubble and of conflict, the 1953 Paramount film Roman Holiday, which all of you I'm sure know, was a clarion call for a different kind of freedom, for Americans and others to return to Europe and fill the continent once again with their tourist trade, with their business, and the spirit of virtually every movie that hits the heart with romance. Now, while the challenges of the recent COVID pandemic are not the same as the human tragedies of war, of course, we nonetheless came through once again this new pandemic. We came through it together. Last year, I had the honor of addressing European exhibitors at Cine Europe in Barcelona, where I told them that our unity and our shared purpose were once again the key factors to our success. The film and television industry and governments across Europe teamed up to keep our workers solvent when the pandemic, grounded productions and shut everything down to a halt. They also worked to spur a wider economic recovery, magically creating desirable jobs for a major part of the economy that needs employment, which is young people. And thanks to the sheer resiliency and the initiative of European filmmakers and distributors, Europe suffered far less of a drop in earnings, of a drop in admissions and productions than many other regions around the world. We've always recognized that despite national borders, our industry works and lives in a shared space with shared values and shared interests, and that we're going to thrive and continue to be important economic drivers in our respective economies when we stand together to meet challenges. Since the earliest days of cinema, we've always worked for strong copyright protection and enforcement, and to fight those who would take the hard work of our creators and exploit it without compensating them. We're fighting hard to make sure that never happens. And I believe that Andrea Callas, who I mentioned several times today, has been looking into the history of the MPA and discovered that our earliest working groups at the motion picture in our history, we are very aware of the need to protect content at a global level. And so this goes pretty far back. As I recently told international exhibitors that were gathered in Las Vegas for CinemaCon convention, piracy is one of the most formidable challenges we face now and into the future. Piracy is an existential threat to our business, and we're building big coalitions to try to fight this and make it possible. We entered into a group called the Alliance for Creativity and Entertainment, or as we call it, ACE, and it's a global coalition not only of the MPA's 6 studios plus Amazon and Apple, but also the world's biggest entertainment companies, including European partners such as Canal+, BBC Worldwide, Constantine Film, Group Globo, Sky, many others. Nearly 40, all told, working together to fight this threat and take down illegal streaming subscription services run by operators all over the world. We work in partnership with Europol, Interpol, and a huge network of local law enforcement around the world, and we're making considerable headway, and yes, we're making arrests. We're also taking civil action through the MPA to block pirate sites, using laws that were pioneered here in Europe and which are now embraced by dozens of countries around the world. And I need to note, ladies and gentlemen, that piracy of today is quite different than the piracy of our early days, in that these pirate groups are run by criminals, by mobsters, by organized crime operating on the dark web. They're massive institutions, and they require a team of experts to take them down globally, and we've assembled that team. And when the rule of law applies equally to the online and the offline world, our industry can be fully protected. That's the vision that drove the entire audiovisual sector to work so closely together to strengthen the Digital Services Act, the DSA, which is nearing its finalization at the European level. The DSA, I know many of you share our belief, will not deliver everything we wanted, but with persistence and continued solidarity, we're going to achieve our shared vision for rule of law in the online environment. You can be sure of it. And if you doubt it, just think about all that we've achieved and all we've overcome together over the past century. And I'm looking forward to today's discussion, which will take place in a couple minutes. We're not only here to commemorate our years together, but look forward to the ones ahead, and to a world where theatricality and streaming and the internet are increasingly part of the same shared content space. So as I look around today, I see an industry doing the right things to embrace the future and to evolve. For example, here in Cannes, for the first time, the Cannes Film Festival invited TikTok as a sponsor, as well as Brut, which many of you know is a rising digital media startup, to connect with new generations of fans and people who love movies. And our member studios and many streaming giants continue to work together with European partners both in film and in television. Now, I believe that our unity is the passport to the future. And I'm reminded of something that Jean Cocteau, who was the head of the Cannes jury 3 times, something he once said. He said, and I quote, "The Cannes Film Festival is an apolitical no man's land, a microcosm of what the world would be like if people could contact each other directly and speak the same language." Well, we've been working together and speaking the same language now for 100 years. So may we continue to find ways to do so in the many centuries to come. Thank you so much. And so I'd love it if my good friend Julien Marcel, CEO of Box Office, would take the stage and prendre la parole. Merci.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Charlie, for inviting me to participate today in the MPA's 100-year anniversary. I'm all the more grateful for that just a few months ago, Charlie, you were kind enough to give a wonderful keynote for the 100-year anniversary of Box Office that we organized in Paris with the CNC. When Ben Schleien, the founder of Box Office, founded the magazine in Kansas City in 1920, he was just 18 years old. He shared his passion for the nascent motion pictures industry with a close friend of his, same age. And this guy had just been fired. And in the following years, he would create 2 companies that failed until he finally started a company some of you may be familiar with in 1923. His name was Walter Elias Disney. Yeah, rings a bell, right? It was their dream that they were taking part in an industry that would live to see many years to come. A proud dream that a century later continued to live on. The motion pictures industry and their members have been an integral part of our industry since its founding and will continue to be a vital part of its success for the years to come. We have covered the MPA in our pages since its inception in 1922, and I've been proud to promote their initiatives. Something we have always valued, and I know Charles is a perfect testament to this, is the undeniable importance of the long-standing and deep-rooted relationship between France and the US. There is no better place than Cannes to celebrate this, and needless to say that as the French publisher of a US trade magazine and website, I am particularly committed to this relationship. On this occasion, celebrating 100 years of the MPA, I'd like to read words from a letter penned by Eric Johnston, the former president of MPA, in a 1950 testimonial dinner celebrating the 30th anniversary of our own publication, Box Office. What Johnston said about Schleien and Box Office at that time applies so well to Charles Rifkin and the MPA today. He said, and I say, you love this industry. You are enthusiastic about the industry. You know that the industry has its share of shortcomings, and you have done so much to help correct them and make it a better industry. You know above all that the motion picture has no superior among the mediums of expression in serving the vast public at home and abroad. You have always been on the good side, on the positive side of things. You are one of the most constructive forces in our industry. We are all proud of you. You have helped us be all prouder of our industry. It is a pleasure to salute the Motion Pictures Association on this 100th anniversary. And since we share the belief that words, even with a sophisticated and distinctive French accent, cannot replace images, I'm very happy to share with you a quick video that turned the pages, and let's turn the pages together of 100 years of friendship with the MPA through the eyes of Box Office. Thank you.
Wait a minute. You ain't heard nothing yet.
You men want to work?
Sure we want to work. Where it at?
All you have to do is turn that dial, and you have all the company you want.
Going through a party in the county jail. You can be my wingman anytime.
I'll be honest with you, I find your accent quite funny.
much fun for me to be back here in Paris and back here for the first time ever with Box Office.
Hi everyone. I'm Perrine Kenson. I'm a journalist for the French magazine, Le Film Français. I would like to thank you, the MPA, for giving me the opportunity to moderate this roundtable. So thank you very much. And thank you, Charles Rifkin, for your keynote, which is also a great introduction, amazing introduction to our roundtable. First, I would like to introduce and invite on stage the panelists. So first, we have Olivier Loube, professor and historian, author of the book Cannes 1939, Le Festival qui n'a pas eu lieu, and the documentary of the same title. You can come on stage. Adrian Wooten, a chief executive at the British Film Commission. Andrea Callas, Senior Vice President of Archives at Paramount Pictures. And Valérie Lépine, CEO of the French Independent Film Producers Union, aka UPC. So thank you all for being here. In these next few minutes, we are going to tell you all a story. The story of the close relationship between the MPA and Europe. Mais tout d'abord, et je vais switcher en français, je vais passer de...
But first and foremost, and I'm going to switch from English to French constantly, well, first we're in the Cannes Film Festival, if you haven't noticed. And Olivier, just as Charles said, MPA and Cannes have a very specific story they share together. I wish to thank the MPA, Charles Rifkin, because I met him for Cannes 1939 in Orleans. Stan McCoy, because he's one of my heroes and the predecessor of Harold Smith, whom I wrote a lot about and who represented the MPA and the MPPD in 1939, and Sabine Hensla, because I do not want anyone to forget her. So it's always strange for a historian to come to a film market, but when you study history, you're not trying to find lessons from the past, but you're trying to understand what in the past were paths chosen for the future. And here, what matters, as Charles Rifkin said, is to see what can be created from what we understood happened in the past. So in 1939, our futures were transatlantic, and this is how we should start, because Cannes in 1939 was created by the French government, Jean Zay, who was the first head of the Cannes Film Festival, but also not the United States, but the MPA, that is, the American cinema was represented by the industry of the producers and distributors in America. And that mattered. Cannes could exist because the government wished it, but also it was a choice to create a festival because we did not want to Mussolini or Hitler to be angry. And those are indications of what we should do now for the future. So Jean Zay chose to create a festival and try to counter the Mostra Film Festival because they were created by the fascist forces. So Jean Zay worked to create this festival. Can you tell us more of the relationship between Jean Zay and the MPA? Well, Jean Zay loved America, and he especially loved Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So So he went to the USA on the spring of 1939. He met with Roosevelt and Edward Beneš, who was the former leader of Czechoslovakia. Jean Zay is from the left and is anti-fascist and anti-Munich. He loves America, he loves movies, is committed against fascism, and he meets with Harold Smith, who's the European representative of the MPA. And Harold Smith is the one who will be the most consistent because he left Venice in 1938. And in fact, the Americans did not come back to Venice in 1939, while the French and the British come back. And he does everything he can for the Cannes Film Festival to be created. The relationship between Jean Zay and Harold Smith are very strong. And there are many discussions between the MPA and the French government. And at the end of June 1939, the first regulation of the Cannes Film Festival is being approved because there was a last discussion between the French government and the MPA, the American MPA. And this agreement is what we would call soft power for cinema, what Jean Zay called cultural diplomacy. You have to show your cultural muscles, in fact. And as Charles said in 2019, culture matters. So the idea is only a festival of the free world can create the soft power that democracy want to put in place. So first, the idea was to oppose dictatorships through political liberalism, and Jean Zay and Roosevelt agree on that. And second, an economic transaction. Because if the MPA wishes to create a festival in Cannes, well, in Italy, everything thought that cinema would become an art, and everyone was delighted to go to the Lido of Venice. But Mussolini in 1938 organizes protectionism, and he says that the money from imported movies will go to the Italian government. And Jean Zay has a different deal because he says, in fact, in French, dubbed movie will be free. So in 1939, there's a new deal between the American industry, the French government, for a freedom of the market, which is a blueprint from the Bloomberg Agreement. Okay? Easy transition for me right now, but if we say Cannes, we say film, of course, because there are films in Cannes, there are not only conferences. And as Charles said earlier when he talked about Marcel Pagnol, the MPA and the USA were came very early to produce French movies. Yes, this is something that should be studied, in fact, because American production are part of European cinema. And in 1939, when the French government and Jean Zay, as a cultural minister, say that there should be no quota for the entrances of American movie, he's supported by French producers. And people do not understand that because French producers agree to liberalize this market, but in fact it's because the American film industry finances the French cinema when it's in a crisis, because the 30s are a catastrophe for European production, and especially in France. So American capital are one of the conditions, not the only one, but one of the conditions of the French film industry survival.
Is also the implication of the MPA and the United States into the British film industry as well.
Absolutely. I mean, it's interesting what was just being said by Olivier, because in actual fact, it's almost the reverse with the UK industry. I mean, there's obviously been an incredibly close relationship between the US industry and the UK industry almost from its inception, and a talent exchange that's gone on across the Atlantic for the whole 100 years. But what's interesting is that, apart from the fact that, you know, Charlie Chaplin, first global film star, happens to be British, making movies in America, but you go on from that into the sound era, and what Olivier was talking about in terms of deregulation here, it was the complete opposite in the UK. What happened is we introduced laws, quota regulations, and those quota regulations led to an actual explosion of cheap British content being funded by the studios. Now, they were demeaned, these pictures, in the 1930s, but they actually were directed by people like Michael Powell, and they're actually a lot of them are remarkably good, and the training they provided for technicians, for screenwriters and directors, actually could be argued formed the bedrock of what became the basis, the framework of classic British cinema of the 40s, 50s, 60s. All of the people that worked on those then worked on most of the sort of British cinematic masterpieces. And then the US industry, even though the quota quickie thing died, the US industry carried on investing in British talent. There was a long-standing relationship, not just a distribution relationship, but that constant talent exchange. Alexander Korda, I mean, the Third Man is partly funded out of the UK, but it's actually funded by David O. Selznick and uses American talent to shoot in both Vienna and the UK. You have films like The African Queen, which again is co-funded British and American in 1950, and that is also shot on British studios. There are just examples in decade after decade that sort of go on through the 1960s, the 1970s. Of course, you have all the Star Wars movies made in the 1970s. You have films like Alien. So even though there's ups and downs in British cinema, and there's all kinds of complicated cultural and political interactions, the sustenance of the relationship between MPA members and the UK industry has stayed pretty much constant. I mean, of course, now we're in a completely different era where it's absolutely bigger than it's ever been, healthier than it's ever been, stronger than it's ever been, both in terms of infrastructure and talent and content creation on a scale that we've probably never seen in any of our lifetimes before. But it's built on the bedrock of roots that go back throughout that century. I mean, Stanley Kubrick making all of his films funded by Warner Brothers in the UK, all the Harry Potter films being made in the UK, Warner Brothers making that decision to make all of those movies here and it's the same with Disney and the relationship we have with companies like Paramount as well, and all the Mission Impossible movies being made in the UK. So it's an incredibly close, creative relationship, an incredibly powerful relationship that spans this whole 100 year, and I think remains very exciting for us, because American movie makers like to come to the UK and make films. British stars and talent like to go to the US, and that shuttlecock across the Atlantic is almost unceasing.
Et Valérie, je me tourne aussi vers vous parce que avec Olivier.
Valerie, let me turn to you, because with Olivier we talked about the origins of the implication of the US in the French production, but now members of the US MPA still have an impact on the French diversity. Yes, it's absolutely true, Perrine. Might be slightly technical, but the budget of the CNC, that is the National Center of Cinematography, is partly fueled by a tax which is perceived on all cinema tickets. So approximately 10% goes to the National Center for Cinematography, and this budget allows us to finance films from diversity, that is varied content, varied genres, varied geographical areas, varied budgets, because you can have small-scale films that is 1 million euros, which is really far from the films the MPA produces, I guess. And we can say, even though this is counterintuitive, that American blockbuster contribute to finance the film of European and French diversity. Tom Cruise, Top Gun, allowed indirectly to finance Frères et Sœurs that you might have seen yesterday and was directed by Arnaud Desplechin. So we say thank you, Tom. And I wish also to underline that when we consider diversity, it is important to have emerging talent. That is to allow young directors or script writers, be they male or female, to have small budget works, because talents cannot be discovered when you invest 60 or $120 million. There's another fight which is common to the member of the MPA and Europe and France especially. That is piracy. Piracy is a challenge, and Charles Rifkin talked about it. And there's an organization in France called ALPA, which is partly financed by the MPA also. Yes, that's true, Perrine. And I know the representatives of ALPA are in the second row in this room. So it's an association which fights piracy, and it was created in 1985. And the initiative was taken by the MPA. And the role of ALPA is very important in the fight against piracy, because the means to use content make piracy quite easy. And the role of the MPA globally, but especially in France, is a crucial role. The National Center for Cinema is also committed to this fight. And some actions will be presented by the ALPA in the next few months, so that some pirate website could be closed because they are showing French works. So the fight against piracy is indeed a hot topic, and it matters a lot to us.
Piracy was already in the mind of the MPA members since its creation in Dria.
So our founder, Paramount's founder, Adolf Zucker, was very instrumental in the creation of an organization that he knew was critical to protect the industry. Issues that would be, regulatory of the industry they were afraid of, but also the concern about what was happening at the time, which was literally copying prints and distributing them and not paying for them to the people who made them, was a concern even in the teens and 20s as motion pictures first started to take off. So yes, even in the earliest days, in the founding of the MPA, along with the instrumental people that came together to create it, the concern over looking at those major issues of what this industry was going to be like. They could see into the future that this would be a long-term thing, that was part of it.
Yeah, that's amazing. They didn't know what was going to happen, and wow, if they knew. But another topic that is at the heart of the MPA's work is film preservation. And you, as the head of the archives at Paramount, you have a lot to tell us about it. So, and this, I think it's something, this film preservation, something that is also a bit inspired by the relationship with Europe. But can you tell me?
So I think. First of all, I think that what is interesting to connect to sort of this concept of piracy and protecting the industry too is just the whole notion of copyright and how that led to preservation. So when Thomas Edison wanted to copyright his films, at that point they weren't considered actual works that could be copyrighted. It actually took an act of Congress for films to be copyrighted at all. And so what he did was he actually printed out on paper the films that he made, because the Library of Congress would take books. Those were paper. That would work. So he printed them out on paper and deposited those. And in that process, actually preserved the films that he made, because nobody knew what to do with film yet. And even in those early days of the MPA and people talking about that, even then people were talking about how could they preserve this stuff, what could happen. And even Will Hayes reached out to the head of the Department of Agriculture at one point because they knew how to keep things cold. Maybe they could help. But there was an interest in this concept of preservation, I think partly around the protection of property, but it quickly also became the concept of legacy and cinema and protecting, in my opinion, the world's greatest art. And that expanded over time.
But I think you told me something about Henri Langlois.
So fast forward to in the 1960s when George Stevens Jr., who's the son of the great director, and also a director in his own right, and has a passion for film because of his father and his father's films, but understands the history of cinema. He comes to Cannes and meets with Henri Langlois, who, of course, ran the Cinémathèque Française, and really starts to understand in a greater way the need for a national concept of film preservation and film legacy, and goes back and works very closely with Jack Valenti to form the American Film Institute. And the Motion Picture Association was critical in really making that happen and starting this concept of preservation. And through that act, actually some of the silent films from Paramount and other studios were preserved at the Library of Congress and deposited there during that time as well. So yeah, thank you, Henri Langlois.
And just asking, how many movies Paramount has in its catalog?
About 3,000.
3,000, yeah. So that's a big library. And how many of them are restored?
So we've been preserving and restoring films pretty consistently for the last 10 years, and about half, we've gotten through about half of them. So
that's amazing, and that's
including, I must have to add, including the film that we really believe started Paramount, which is actually a French film.
Oh, it's French. Tell me the story, because we do love being at the center of a story. That's the French way.
So there was a film called The Loves of Queen Elizabeth, which starred Sarah Bernhardt, the very famous actress. And it was actually, Pathé Frères was working on it and needed some money to complete it. And Adolf Zucker gave some money, and in exchange was able to distribute it in the U.S. And it was in a theater in Manhattan where it stayed for a year and played. It was a longer film, so in 1912 when it was released, people weren't used to longer films. There she is.
There she is.
There's Sarah.
Sarah Bernhardt.
Looking very dramatic.
She is, yeah.
But it was also this concept, which obviously the people that made the film also had a notion of, which is if you put somebody famous in a movie, then people might come to the theater. That kind of caught on. But yes, that was so incredibly popular that it allowed Paramount to expand globally. And so we mark our anniversary with 1912 with the release of this French film.
And there is another movie you restored recently, because let's go full circle to Cannes, because in Cannes, the heritage cinema is also very important with the selection Cannes Classique. And tonight there is also a movie from one of the members of the MPA, Paramount, that is screened on the beach screen. I don't know how to... Cinéma de la Plage.
Well, first of all, I can't say enough about Cannes Classic and the contribution that they have made. I actually was having a discussion with somebody yesterday that actually does some of the screening of the films that come to classics, and they're saying hundreds and hundreds of films are actually submitted into the Cannes Classic category, which means there's so much restoration and preservation going on all over the world. It's just wonderful to hear. So thank you, Cannes Classic, for highlighting that. And tonight, I'm so pleased that our recent restoration celebrating the 50th anniversary of Godfather will be on the beach, and I invite all of you to come to that because I'm incredibly proud of it, and I think it looks fantastic, so thank you. And thanks for the opportunity to do that.
And you know what you're doing tonight now, so going to watch The Godfather, which is great, actually. That's a great program. And so we see that there is a long story between the MPA and Europe as well, but there is also a future, I guess. We don't stop now. It's not 100 and stop. It's now we're looking to the future. And as the video from Box Office Pro said, Netflix just joined also the MPA. And Valérie, voilà, je viens de le dire, Netflix a rejoint la MPA. Et
Valerie, I just said Netflix joined the MPA, so it's quite interesting to turn to streaming platform, especially thanks to the SMA directive in Europe and agreements that were set in place. Those agreements are an opportunity for French creation. Yes, I should say future is now, if I may, because in the last few years there was a spectacular acceleration of movie consumption on small screens. The COVID unfortunately contributed to this acceleration, and in France, Netflix and Disney Plus are the two platforms that release works in such a way. The SMA directive was used in France, and it encourages or makes it compulsory for streamers to invest in local production. That is 20 to 25% of the turnover in France. And that's an important number, much more than in other European countries, because the percentage is less than 10% in other European countries. And for Netflix, it represents 40,000 million euros in local cinema production. And there's also a specific law which we discussed. On those 40,000 million, 4 million will be given for production of diversity films, that is smaller scale movies, and it means 10 movies a year. And it's very important for us because, again, it allows to have a varied production. So the MPA, with those new media, that is the streaming platform, well, they provide an opportunity to create. Yes, it's an opportunity. This morning I was sitting at another roundtable here, and people said that 2,030 million a year were invested by those streamers in French production. So, of course, for us, financially, it's extraordinary. And because we are a small village, an Asterix village, we wish to preserve the cultural diversity. I'm sorry I'm repeating this, but I care for cultural diversity. And we also wish our producers to be independent. We're very happy to work with the streamers that will be committed to co-productions and might travel around the world. And we are convinced that those movies presented by streamers, Disney, Netflix, and the other platforms to come, will also allow that the creations might be seen in theaters and that we might keep on laughing, crying, be excited in front of big screens.
Opportunities can this arrival of the platform and the future maybe of the MPA can enable us, according to you?
Well, picking up on what Valerie was saying and her emphasis on diversity, I think that looking forward, there's an incredible opportunity. The demand for content amongst the consumer is clearly unabated. It's just going up and up and up. The amount of content that's being made by the studios and the streamers, and we certainly see that reflected in the huge amount of work that's going on in London and the whole, actually not just London, but all of the nations and regions of the UK are benefiting from this extraordinary change driven by film, but driven also by hand television. And what I see is I'd say two things. I mean, perhaps three. The first is diversity, the opportunity, all this work and building new infrastructure. And I know there's new studios being built in France. We're building something like 3 million square feet of studio space over the next 3 years in the UK. And all of that requires people. It requires more people, more jobs, more fantastic job opportunities. So the MPA members working with France, working with other European territories, working with the UK, are helping us create long-term, fantastic new job opportunities and economic prosperity. And what I want us to do, and we are doing with the MPA members, is to try and build up that skills pipeline. I know there's a real commitment here in France. There's a real commitment in the UK. We announced a partnership with Universal, one of the studio members, just the other day in Los Angeles, and actually about training. And it's also not just skills, but it is very much about diversity, the diversity of the workforce. Obviously, London has a hugely diverse population, and so do lots of other European territories. And being able to harness those opportunities and bring that young, diverse workforce in, because we need their talent, we need their vision, we need their difference into the workforce. And that's one of the other major opportunities. So for me, skills, workforce, and diversity of that workforce, I think, is one of the opportunities to work looking forward to the future. And on top of that, and linked to that, is also about sustainability, environmental sustainability. The studios are doing an awful lot of work with us and with other European territories about sustainability, showing the way how an industry can green itself in terms of the way it makes things, but also where it makes things in terms of building new sustainable studio locations. And that also relates to my third point, which is the other thing that is happening is the pace of technological innovation and change in our industry. We are really at a white, sort of hot heat moment in terms of when you look at virtual production, you look at the way in which virtual production and is linking games technology and film and television together, the way in which, and all of that relating to kind of visual effects. I think it's a really incredibly creative and exciting time. And if looking forward, if we can harness the opportunities of the technology, if we can harness the opportunities of building that skills base and that workforce and building it in a diverse and inclusive way, then we've got an enormous, incredibly exciting future that very few other industries can boast of. So that's what I'd say. I feel very optimistic about the future of our industry and our relationship with the MPA and its members.
And on the preservation side, if I understand correctly, Andrea, the issue and the challenge is on the digital preservation.
Yeah, I think there's two parts, I think, to the future. One is, the older films and the restoration of them and their sort of emergence into festivals like this and people understanding them. I was remembering, as Charlie was mentioning, Roman Holiday, when we restored that film, which was, stars Rome. It's like a character in that film. It was also written by the blacklisted director, Dalton Trumbo. And during our restoration, we were able to restore his name to that film, and worked closely with the Writers Guild to do that, and brought that out, and was able to tell that history when we brought that film back. And so remembering the history of cinema and the twists and turns of that history is part of that, and we're seeing much more interest in that. But yes, the other part is really paying attention to how we preserve things shot with digits, ones and zeros, and not with celluloid. And I've done a ton of work on that. I'm working with the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences on a project called the Academy Digital Preservation Forum. I invite you all to check it out. Just type those words into your local browser and you'll find it. But it's totally possible. It's complex. And there are a lot of really smart people working on it, is really what I need to say. But I think the other thing, just picking up on diversity as well, is the films made digitally are from an incredibly diverse set of people, some brilliant art made in that way. And so we owe it to ourselves to think about how we preserve things, not just on film, but digitally as well. And that's an important part of the history of cinema, in my opinion.
And pour finir, Olivier, puisque...
Okay, probably last question, Olivier, because we'll be wrapping up soon. So MPA was there at the start of the Cannes Film Festival. It's lasted for 83 years. Do you think the next 83 years will be similar? Well, if you look at the image over there, first you can see two things. Mr. Smith goes to Cannes, but in 1931, he comes to Cannes to show Mr. Smith goes to Washington. And if you think of those two elements, you can think about the future. Harold Smith is the guy which is just behind the Perrine finger, and then you have Joncé. But also in the back, you have a representative of the Paramount, Henry Clausfold, who was present at this dinner because the whole American film industry was present. So it means that when you preserve movies, when you try to look into history, as I said earlier, we are trying to understand how history matters in cinema. For example, there's no history of the Cannes Film Festival that was ever written, or an history that would take into account the movies as an industry, an art, and also a political choice. Now, this global history of the cinema, we needed to think about the new era that Rifkin was invited us to look at. Because when we preserve movies, in fact, we build a library of the heritage, the DNA heritage of cinema. And this is really crucial. And this history of cinema, as a genre, but also as a heritage, might allow us to look towards the future, because we can identify who did what, how, what were the choices made, so that future is not doomed. So, to be quick and repeat what was said in Cannes in 1979, history and conservation of cinema.
But it is cinema.
Thank you all. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. No. There is a little drink out there if you want to have a, to have a little drink. Il y a un petit verre qui vous attend là-bas derrière si ça vous.
There's a cocktail over there, so don't hesitate to have a drink.